George Johnson, are you there?
Hey, John, I am. How are you?
I'm good, George, and I have to say it is really good to talk to you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has been a while. God, how long has it been? Months.
I guess I should have looked back in the archives, but I think at least a couple of months, and in the meantime, Jesus Christ, a lot is happening out there in the world, George.
Yeah, man, Japan.
Yeah.
Is the first thing that comes to mind to me.
Yeah. I'm even thinking of, I'm boring the hell out of my students at Stevens because I keep going into class and saying, do you guys, this is a history of science class, and I say, do you guys realize how much history is being made right now? And they all just kind of look at me blankly, and I say, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, all these things happening. And then this gigantic tidal wave in Japan that's rocking our faith in technology and civilization, let alone nuclear power.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys have to pay attention to this.
Yeah, and they say whatever.
Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah. Well, I remember being in Vietnam during Watergate, and on one hand, I felt really immersed in history, and participating in demonstrations and also writing about them as a participatory journalist. I was really trying to do a little Norman Mailer thing, I guess, at the University of New Mexico. But at the same time, I'm kind of embarrassed to realize in retrospect, how little I really followed the details and meaning of a lot of things. And, I had a copy of Francis Fitzgerald's book, Fire in the Lake, about the history of Vietnam leading into the war, and I don't think I ever actually read it. It was more just like reacting on the surface without getting into the depth. But maybe the depth is for later.
Well, I don't know. I think journalists are, most of us are dilettantes, right, George? We go flitting about from topic to topic.
Yeah,
and
I wouldn't say dilettantes, but I'd say we're generalists.
Okay.
Journalists
That's
are
a nice
generalists.
way of putting it.
Journalists are generalists.
Yeah, I figure it's my job not to really tell my students what's going on, but to alert them that there are things going on that they should then go out and find out more about themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll start with a fairly trivial piece of news.
Okay.
But something that it's a topic that we've talked about before. So we've both talked about the Templeton Foundation. We of course participated in a fellowship sponsored by the foundation back in 2005. The Templeton Foundation is this gigantic, very wealthy organization that funnels money into these attempts to sort of promote some kind of better relationship between science and religion. And it was created by this financier, John Templeton, back in the 80s, and actually even earlier, he started giving out this annual award, the Templeton Prize.
Right.
It's worth now about $1.5 million.
Yeah, it's £1 million, isn't it?
Pardon? Yeah,
it's £1 million, I think. So yeah, depending on how the dollar's doing, which is
it's
pretty
actually he stipulated that it has to be more than the Nobel Prize.
Oh.
Because he thought that it's a shame that scientists get all this money and recognition for their achievements, but he thought
all
that
the
there
time.
needed to be recognition for achievements in the realm of spirituality.
Right.
And so anyway, the early recipients were actually just religious figures, and recently, of course, over the last few decades, they have been, for the most part, scientists, also some philosophers and other scholars, whose work in some way can be seen as possibly compatible with religion. And the recipient this year, I know you're on tenterhooks.
Yeah, I actually don't know because I'll tell you why later, but I've been buried in something and haven't been following such important events.
Oh, okay. Well, I look forward to hearing about that. So I'll just tell you, it was Martin Rees.
Martin Rees, Sir
Rees.
Martin.
Yes, Sir Martin.
Astronomer Royal of Britain and the what do they call it? The headmaster of Trinity College and the president of the Royal Society, all at various times.
Yeah, just a real good guy.
Reese is great. You know, when we were actually in Cambridge for that Templeton Fellowship, for some reason he knew my work. He must have read one of my books or some articles or something, and he asked our friend Martin Redfern, the BBC science editor, who was one of our fellows, if he thought he could meet me during the workshop, and I thought, well, yes. I mean, it's more like, could I possibly ever get to meet Martin Reese? So then he wandered into one of those receptions, you know, where everyone's standing around kind of awkwardly with a glass of wine, and
I remember.
And, I mean, this was early on, so I guess that's why it was awkward. I think it was at one of the colleges. I can't remember which. It wasn't Trinity. And then I actually got to finally meet him in person, but you'd probably met him before.
I actually met him at a Nobel Symposium back in 1990 where Stephen Hawking was, and Andre Linde and Jim Peebles and all these greats of
I remember when you wrote
cosmology.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I really liked him. And he's one of those people he's a wonderful explainer. His work is primarily in Big Bang cosmology, black hole physics. I think he's dabbled in multiverse theories and things like that. He got a lot of attention back in 2003. He wrote a book that was warning that humanity might be doomed by bioterrorism or nanotechnology run amok, and that we needed to start thinking about escape routes into outer space in case that the Earth became unlivable. But what's interesting about him getting the Nobel Prize is that he describes himself as someone who goes to church, mainly because he likes the music and the rituals, and he was raised an Anglican, I guess, but he doesn't believe in God himself. He calls himself a non-believing Anglican. Right. And it sort of reminds me about the kind of strange situation that the Templeton Foundation is in. I actually got a letter from an email from Jack Templeton, who now he's the son of the guy who founded it, and he now operates or oversees the Templeton Foundation. And Jack emailed me. You know, obviously this is a mass email asking for nominations. This was last summer, and he said there's this phrase that I want to draw attention to. The Templeton Prize parallels growing attention to the idea that progress in spiritual information is just as feasible as progress in the sciences.
Just as feasible. So you that sounds a little more dilute than what they were going after before.
So I actually just finished writing a piece for Scientific American saying that, to me, there is no such thing, obviously, as progress in spirituality, at least not in any way analogous to progress in science.
No, I mean, someone like personally... I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Well, I'm just going to say scientific progress proceeds by empirical investigation, which disproves some theories or confirms or at least provides very good grounds for believing in other theories. There is nothing remotely like that in the realm of, I don't know, theology or spiritual studies, spiritual investigations. In the realm of spirituality, you have all sorts of opinions and proclamations and revelations and so forth, but there's not a single fact in the entire realm of theology and religion.
Not a single fact.
Not a single spiritual fact.
Okay. But what I was going to say is, I mean, I can see how you could say a person makes spiritual progress. I mean, I still cringe when I hear the word spiritual for some reason, but you know, what does that mean? But spiritual progress in the sense that someone might, become, by some set of moral standards, a better person. Of course, then you're begging the question of moral standards and where do moral standards come from, and if there's any scientific basis for that, which we've talked about that whole thing before with group selection and evolution of morality and things. But I would. But as far as religion or spirituality as a whole making progress, that just doesn't. It's just not doesn't fit in the same frame as science.
No, because there's not. and this is something that this kind of rhetoric you often hear from the Templeton Foundation and from people that it sponsors, that there is some kind of rough equivalence between religion and science.
Yeah.
But there's absolutely no equivalence when it comes to sort of empiricism and the way that various propositions are tested against reality.
No, yeah, I would say, I mean, on a much higher meta level, equivalent in the sense that are both, are systems of trying to explain the world and organizing this welter of evidence from our paltry little senses into some kind of a system. But then science is clearly very different in that the system is actually make statements that are open to refutation by experiment and cross-checks, to use the title of a famous column in Scientific American, with reality. So, I mean, it just seems so obvious to me it shouldn't even be controversial, and that doesn't mean that, everyone should, give up their, religion and immediately become an atheist, because I think religion in many contexts does a lot of good.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I guess we're both like agnostics/atheists. And
yeah, it's, again, part of the puzzle for me, I actually love theology. I love good theology because I find it really profound and moving in the way that great literature can be. But when it is presented as a kind of scholarly, rigorous, intellectual discipline that can make progress, let's say like philosophy, although philosophy has its own problems, then I really started having trouble with it. I actually participated in a panel discussion a couple of nights ago at Seton Hall, a Catholic university in New Jersey, and with a Catholic priest and a theologian, and the theologian objected to something I said about the Big Bang, and was giving me the Catholic doctrine of creation. What's the Latin term? Ad nihilo, or how do you get something out of nothing?
Creation from nothing is
Yeah, and it was this really complicated, sort of technical explanation, and it was bizarre because, of course, it was essentially meaningless.
Yeah.
But he was presenting it as though it was a real kind of argument in the same way that cold dark matter would be a real argument.
Yeah, and I can see, within, you're remembering that you're speaking within this context, this framework that's based, both on, this historical framework. It's, based on things that you, of a group of people, have agreed are true, and then in that case, you can sort of, make this argument in the same way that you might make an argument, theoretical argument. But yeah, it's just completely different.
And if there is any progress, it's in eliminating some of the really, really bad ideas that they've had in the past. The existence of angels, the existence of a place called hell where you go if you miss Mass on Sunday.
But then again, there's no reason to reject those as opposed to any of the other beliefs, right? I mean, unless your criteria is what's going to be better for people to live happier, more fulfilling lives, and that's a good reason, and you can make progress in that sense. But again, it has nothing even remotely parallel to scientific progress, where ideas can just turn out to be plain wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
I kind of figured you'd agree with me on that.
Well, but it's interesting about Reese, because I'm sure I remember, talking to him at that reception, and him seeming very skeptical about. And I don't know if I should repeat this since it wasn't it's not anything really controversial, but I got so I'll repeat it. I got the feeling that maybe he had even been asked to participate, because we were the very first journalists in this journalism fellowship on science and religion. And I'm sure I remember that he said that he'd been invited to be one of the participants and then decided not to because he thought, he was rather skeptical of the effort and the Templeton effort. And this was he was right there at Trinity at college in Cambridge, and it would have been easy for him to do. And so I was very surprised later to hear that that he was having some sort of friendlier relations with Templeton, and now I'm really surprised to hear that he got this prize. So I think that reflects well on the foundation, actually, because that was the thing. I mean, we've talked about this before, but I came out of this Templeton seminar really feeling, no pressure at all to toe any kind of party line or do anything except maybe to write more about the interesting subject of science and religion, which I would have done anyway, and I was better equipped to do it after this. So I think it's kind of admirable that they pick someone like Rees and not just someone like John Polkinghorne, who's got it in the past, who actually thinks that you can, that there's such a thing as reconciling science and religion, and and is a real serious, deep believer, and has all these ideas about how quantum mechanics, might be a way for God to enter into the universe with his fingers and readjust the dials, and just, utter non-scientific nonsense like that.
Well, what I said at the end of this piece for Scientific American is that early on, the Templeton Prize went to, for example, Charles Colson, one of the people who was convicted for crimes.
The Watergate guy, and
crimes, and then became a born-again preacher. Or
whatever. And he had a prison conversion, right? And then started chaplaincies, I guess is the word, in prisons.
Right. So if you're going from Charles Colson to Martin Rees, I think that's
progress in spiritual understanding. There it is. Well, the Mother Teresa got one of the early awards, maybe the first.
Yes, that's right. Billy Graham got one. So I don't know if I see the Templeton Foundation as evil and insidious. I'm certainly worried about its influence on scholarly pursuits, just because its money is so enormous. Now I see it just kind of as weird, and paradoxical.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to a Templeton seminar in Cambridge, England next month on science and Islam.
I wasn't invited.
Wonder why. But to me, this is an example of a really great thing. So they're I think it's 10 of us again, approximately 10 journalists, and some are former Templeton Journalism Fellows, and I think some are not. I haven't had a chance to look yet at who else is going. But, we're going to hear all these scholars talking about science and Islam, which is a fascinating subject, and it's going to, I know it's going to leave me much. I'm not equipped at all to write about the subject, and this will actually give me an entry into doing that. So plus it's really cool hanging out in Cambridge for a week, and they really put on a class act. Really good shit, really nice dinners at all the colleges, and not all the colleges, but I know I said this before. I'm sorry. I know I said this before, but there was just something about walking on the grounds of Trinity and knowing that Newton had been there with your fellow Templeton fellows, with Martin Redfern and Michael Brooke and
Yeah. You'll have to tell us about that when you come back.
I will.
I teach a little bit of Islamic science in my history of science class, and my knowledge is really sketchy. I'd love to hear what you learn after you come back, and then I can pretend that I know a lot when I tell my students about it.
I'll pretend that I know a lot when I'm telling you.
So, all right. So tell us, where have you been? I know you've had been on some interesting journeys lately.
Yeah, well, first, this is always the dilemma when you have an assignment for a magazine, how much you should tell about the subject. So I'll have to be pretty vague, but it's I'm doing a piece for National Geographic, and it was to involve a journey that started going to Glasgow, Scotland, in March, which is pretty gloomy, actually, it turns out. But anyway, and then after a few days in Glasgow, talking to some people I'm writing about, he says cryptically, we were all to fly to New Delhi, and then continue on by another plane, and then by land to an obscure Hindu temple somewhere in the state of Gujarat. So,
wow.
And it takes a long time to prepare for a trip like this, and I had to get inoculated. I came back from, there's something called emporiatrics. It's a fancy word for travel medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And you go to these doctors, and they say, well, see, if you're going to this part of the world, you'll need this shot, this shot, this shot, this shot, and this shot. Mm-hmm. So I went there, and I got all my injections. I think there were 2 in each arm. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised. They recommended that I get an adult polio vaccine.
Uh-huh.
I already had done Salk and Sabin both as a kid, I think, because Sabin came in a little afterwards. But, they recommend that now, not because they think probably there's really much evidence, if any, of polio and where you're going, but if there were, it would just be so horrible to bring it back to any other part of the world, and that it's like there's no downside to getting the shot. So anyway, so you get all these shots, all these documents, all this red tape, getting a visa from journalist visa from the government of India. Get to Scotland, do the interviewing I'm doing there, and then the day before, I'm just kind of walking around downtown Glasgow, sort of enjoying a day to myself, being a tourist, buying last-minute things I forgot to be in India for 2 weeks, and then suddenly my cell phone rings, and it's the head of this project, and all of their equipment was being held by Indian Customs. Huh. And so then it was like, I had to cancel, call the travel agency that National Geographic uses and have them cancel my flight to India with the thought that we would then have to rebook it at the last minute. Huge expense. But it didn't make sense for me to, go all the way to New Delhi on the chance that this would all fall through. So,
right.
So I waited in Glasgow as long as I possibly could, and they kept not getting clearance. And finally I couldn't. And I have to say, there are very interesting things about Glasgow and some real architectural treasures, and John Rennie Mackintosh, the great architect and designer, and all that. But really, after 3 days, I'd had enough, and after 6, I jumped on a plane and went down to London and decided I'd wait there and had a nice dinner with Michael Brooks, our fellow author friend and Templeton Fellow, and then they never got clearance, and it got so close to summer monsoon season in India that they decided to can the project until next fall. So that occupied a lot of my time, and then more positively, I just got back from a week in lovely Orlando, Florida. I'm really hitting all the world's great marvels. And this was I'm holding up the telephone book-like proceedings of the American Association for Cancer Research 102nd Annual Meeting. And boy,
I assume that's huge.
Yeah, well, it's not as big as neuroscience. They said it was 18,000 people.
Jesus, wow, to me, that's huge.
Yeah, it was huge. Neuro, I think, is at least up to 25, but it's been a while since I've been to one of these big mega conferences, and I just love them. It's like at any one time, there's like dozens of simultaneous sessions going on, and all these little esoteric, like little sub parts of the field of cancer biology and physiology, and it was just fascinating. I came home with a whole notebook full of notes, and then I just started typing them up, and I can see it's going to be like 10,000 words worth of notes at least.
Wow.
I just learned so much because it's it's a new subject to me, and this was just total immersion for a week, and there was nothing else to do because I've heard that Orlando has Orlando, I was corrected last night by a friend who used to live there, and she said, it's not Orlando, it's Orlando, and you have to really drag out that A. It's very nice that there's a nice old historic area, but you're barred from seeing that in these conventions. Like the shuttle from the airport takes you to this horrible, it's called International Drive, and it's anchored on one end by a outlet shopping center. It's anchored on the north end also by another outlet shopping center many miles away, and in between it's packed with giant mega hotels in this the second largest convention center in the United States, and chain restaurants. And you're going from 8 till 6 every day.
Around there somewhere?
What now? Disney World is there. Yeah, I could have gone to Disney World, and Universal Studios has done an outpost there, and SeaWorld, yeah. But I just it was just every day 8 to 6 in the convention center, and then going to the receptions and dinners and things at night.
Anything exciting? Is any cures for cancer on the horizon?
Well, no, but God, just such fascinating. I mean, what's really interesting is for them to understand cancer. They're not going to understand cancer until they understand the cellular and biological basis of life in a level of detail that we really don't yet. I mean, you have the basic Watson-Crick paradigm, after which Crick basically said we understand the secret of life.
Yeah.
And it's true in some ways, but with cancer, when you get down to how it can go wrong, it really makes you focus on all of the little details and the epicycles and filigrees within the grand paradigm. So, there's this whole thing, it's been coming out in the last, slowly over the last half decade or more, about how junk DNA is not really junk.
Yeah.
And, this is the thing
they called it junk DNA because they just didn't understand what it did yet, right?
Yeah, and they also thought it was junk, actually, because it was, the deal is that like 2% of the genome is actually the Watson-Crick part. This is the part where the DNA codes for amino acids, which makes proteins, and there's this neat little mechanism with transfer RNA and messenger RNA and ribosomal RNA. And that was all down, and then they just kind of thought, well, 98% of the genome is maybe just evolutionary junk, like it's genes that mutated and lost their usefulness, or remnants from copying errors or from viruses getting into a body and splicing, retroviruses splicing some of their little genes into the genome and then running away and after the cell explodes. So it was called relic DNA too, but and of course now they're finding interesting evidence that, like, for example, a gene in the tiny 2%, the canonical genome, will have an evil twin, or in the other side, in the junk DNA, which basically they're both offspring of an original ancestral gene, and one of them mutated and got shoved over there somehow. I don't know the details well yet, but anyway, so these two genes, they're finding that they might interact. Like, say one's like a tumor repressor gene. Its normal function is when it gets signals, it seems like a cell is starting to divide too crazily, it'll send out restraining orders, like it puts on the brake. So they find these two genes, one in the junk side, one in the non-junk side, talking to each other through this whole new back channel that no one had realized existed, involving whole new kinds of non-coding RNAs. And there was just all kinds of fascinating stuff like that.
Is it your sense, I remember after reading a book by Carl Zimmer on, I think the title is Microcosm, or it was basically about E. coli.
Yeah, right.
And what was being learned by, so the E. coli are sort of the the guinea pigs of cell biology, and they're just as simple as an organism can be, and yet the more that they study this creature, the more complexity they find, and that even genetically identical E. coli will behave in completely different ways for reasons that nobody can really understand.
Yeah.
So the theme that I took away from that book was that this kind of simple, elegant picture that you had back in the 60s and even 70s as a result of the discovery of the double helix and the genetic code and everything was just becoming so complicated now. And that this has implications for treating cancer and for genetic therapy and all these sorts of things.
I think that's exactly right. And the question it raises in my mind is, scientists are very optimistic people, and this is kind of looked at like, wow, beyond the genome, and now we're getting into, all of this whole new territory, and, the field is, exciting and revitalized in a new way. But at the same time, it makes you wonder if, what if Watson and Crick hadn't have come first, and the whole standard, what do they call it, the central dogma of DNA makes RNA makes protein, which, now they're, finding all these exceptions to that. What if they hadn't laid down the law because they had discovered this elegant mechanism earlier on, and say they had discovered or concentrated on the junk DNA first off the bat, and they would come up with this whole different, it would have said the same thing in an equivalent way, but a whole different kind of model of how the cell works. And maybe there's some way where you can pull out the card at the bottom of the house of cards and it collapses and you can rebuild it into a more elegant one, because it's starting to seem really cumbersome with, epicycles to the epicycles to, the original standard dogma.
That's so interesting. It's almost as though, I don't know if this is what you're implying, but that, what all fields crave is the great unifying insight that helps guide your research and helps you put new results into this kind of framework that makes sense of them. Obviously, evolution did that. The double helix did that. But maybe those great insights can channel science too much.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, and blind you to all these really important things that are going on.
Yeah. That's you hit the nail on the head. That's the vague idea that I've been trying to articulate to myself for a few days.
That's really interesting, George. And it seems to me that there's there's a parallel there with obviously with neuroscience, which doesn't even have its great insight yet.
Right.
It's just complexity all the way down.
Yeah, and none of this is to say that the central dogma of Watson and Crick is not, powerful and true, but as you say, maybe, it also, it probably contributed to people ignoring 98% of the genome for so long, and it really reminded me too of another example would be the Big Bang model in cosmology. The Big Bang model, it's basically the only show in town. There's a few people who have alternate theories, but it's just so powerful in organizing, all of the observations we know. And yet you think how all the, major revisions that have been made one after another to do so, like, Alan Guth's inflationary universe thing, where you don't just have the Big Bang, but for, a few tiny unimaginable fractions of a second, suddenly the universe, goes through this wild inflationary epoch. And then, of course, you had to decide, well, actually most of the universe is made out of dark matter, which we can't detect except indirectly by its gravitational influence. And then they had to throw in dark energy. So, again, the model becomes more and more unwieldy, and yet it's almost impossible to imagine that the basic idea of the Big Bang isn't true. And yet you have to wonder.
I just have to mention, since you brought up inflation, I was thinking of bringing that up in our chat anyway. There's an article in I think it's the April issue of Scientific American by Paul Steinhardt, who was one of the first people to work on inflation back in the early 80s. And this article is basically saying that he thinks that maybe inflation is invalid now. There are so many problems with inflation that the problems that it solves for you, and it did solve some puzzles in simple models of the Big Bang theory, are offset, more than offset. That's what I took away from this article, by these really fundamental problems that make virtually all versions of inflation really implausible. One of the problems, it's very much like string theory, is that that inflation basically predicts any possible universe that you can imagine. And so
because
you can't say that our universe in any way represents a confirmation of inflationary theory, because whatever we saw out there would confirm evolutionary theory.
Okay, so so whatever the initial conditions of the universe is, inflation just like basically wipes them out, and erases them in this huge expansion, and then you're just like could start with any sort of blank slate and have any universe. Is that kind of the...
Well, it's that you get a whole broad range of conditions in which inflation might occur. And first of all, there's the problem of the physics of inflation being totally speculative.
Yeah.
If you just grant that, it can occur in a whole range of different initial conditions.
Okay.
And then those different initial conditions can yield really anything. Again, very analogous to the way that there are, 10 to the 500 different versions of string theory that can produce any kind of universe that you like. So it's a theory that basically explains too much.
Wow. So it's totally unconstrained.
Yeah, I hadn't realized. I've always been a skeptic of inflation, just because the basic physics were a real extrapolation of known phenomena.
Yeah.
And I hadn't realized that there are these problems that were leading a lot of the theorists who were real hardcore believers originally.
Yeah. No, I didn't either.
To not believe it anymore.
Wow. Boy, I'll have to read that. While you were explaining that, it just occurred to me, this is a perfect example. Like, this wouldn't happen in theology.
Right.
I really can't imagine that it would. Where one of the leading people in the field of cosmology, Paul Steinhardt, one of the architects of inflation, comes out and then is suddenly questioning, that maybe it's completely wrong, and this huge part of the Big Bang model. I mean, so the Big Bang model continues to be this, this work in creation. I mean, this creation in progress, or creation, this theory in progress. And I know some people will come back and argue that, well, because they do, I've seen this happen, that they argue that theology does progress, and, we have, ideas change, and Catholic theology now is very different from, what it was under St. Augustine or Aquinas, but still, that's not, progress in which you can really believe that you're converging asymptotically on some kind of reality.
Well, the progress in theology, such as it is, consists of becoming much less assertive in the claims that it makes.
Right.
So,
that's a very good point.
That is, and I think that is progress, but what it's headed toward is something like, saying, hey, listen, just an idea, moral guidelines, you don't see it this way, you're free to do as you like.
Right. Hey, before we leave the subject of this conference, I wanted to mention that I encountered two people who were Blogging Heads viewers.
Oh, far out.
No, I think we only get half credit for the first one, who was a woman who now works for Science Magazine, and she was at the Santa Fe Science Writing Workshop in 2007. I think, was that when you were there?
Geez, I think it was.
I think it was, and anyway, but the first thing she said was, I watch you and John on Blogging Heads, and I thought, wow, really? That's so great. And then later, the one that we get full credit for is I was walking in the lobby of, there's this very elegant hotel in the convention complex, the Peabody, and it was just before I stumbled into this lavish reception being held by the MD Anderson Cancer Research Center in Houston. Mm-hmm. This is kind of an interesting sidelight. Like, you go to this conference where all day people are sitting in these sessions, like a whole session devoted to one tiny little pathway inside the cell, or one little receptor, and and just all these, just very micro parts of this huge problem, and others, in cancer prevention and epidemiology, and this very serious, weighty subject about just this, overwhelmingly horrible disease or phenomenon of cancer. And then, you go at night and then you're suddenly walking into this lavish reception by the MD Anderson Cancer Center with all these food tables with, duck quesadillas and Maryland crab cakes and, pouring some really good Bordeaux.
Nice.
Very, very strange. I don't know, there's something interestingly incongruous there, but anyway, I was walking toward this, and suddenly, somebody sometimes at a convention will kind of sidle up to you, and they kind of look down at your name tag, and he says, "Blogging Heads, right?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Yeah, I watch you guys all the time. It's I do it every Saturday morning. So this guy's a regular."
It always makes me feel a little weird. I don't feel unalloyed happiness when I hear that somebody's watching. It's kind of a combination of I'm pleased, I'm grateful, and I'm puzzled at the same time.
Well, it's also a little like someone was. It's just so hard to remember when we're doing these things that anyone's actually involved with this, except you and I just having this chat, which I guess is how it's supposed to be. So, it's almost like, oh, it's a little embarrassing, kind of.
Yeah, right. We forget that there are people out there.
Yeah, we talk off the top of our heads, and pop off about all sorts of things, and
right.
Yeah.
Hey, listen. Before we run out of time, I know that you've been reading a lot of good books lately. I've read a book recently by one of the best science journalists in the business. And this is one of the best science books I've ever read. It's just an amazing achievement. I wanted to tell people about it. It's called The Information by James Glick, who has written a bunch of books. He's best known for his first book, Chaos, which really created chaos theory and complexity, and there was a whole wave of copycat books that came out after that. This book, The Information, is it's a history of information, which in a way is a history of culture. It's a history of history.
Wow.
It's a history of all the ways that we represent reality to ourselves and to each other, and it culminates in, it starts even with, the origins of writing and mathematics and cuneiform tablets and all that stuff, and then takes you right up through the 20th century and the invention of information theory by Claude Shannon, who is, in terms of his contributions to science and technology, he's virtually unknown. And in part because information theory can be very technical and difficult to understand, and Glick just really does him justice and shows you what a fascinating person Shannon was. Also talks about some of the other figures in the 1930s with whom Shannon interacted that inspired him, or with whom he disagreed, like Norbert Wiener, the inventor of cybernetics, and John von Neumann and people like that. Also talks about how information theory has become inspirational for some physicists who are now saying that maybe information, rather than physical entities, rather than particles, information is the basis of reality, which is a really fascinating idea, which I think is totally wrong, but still really fun to think about. So anyway, I just wanted to give the Blogging Heads viewers a heads up on this.
It sounds just wonderful, and I was really amazed because Jim, I guess, what was his last book that he wrote this really nice short biography of Isaac Newton. And there was a book called Faster. He did do kind of smaller ones, and then as far as book publishing, he was just he just disappeared basically. Except that his books that he wrote continued to sell many copies, and I knew he was down in Key West. where he lives part-time, at least part-time now. But I remember there were oblique references to this book, like when he would write an article and it would say, Jim Glick is the author of Chaos and Genius, the biography of Feynman, and he is working on a book about, and then there would be some general description. I remember once it said he's working on a book about, I think it was the history of the telephone.
Uh-huh.
I knew he wasn't writing a history of the telephone,
right.
but then he was getting into some very basic stuff about communication and information, but I had no idea that he was going to emerge with this grand sweep, which I can't wait to read. I read Janet Maslin's glowing review in the New York Times, and I read this really interesting column in Scientific American by you.
Ah, right. That was my, the one. So I wrote a review of
the Wall Street Journal too.
For the Wall Street Journal, and it was basically just a rave review. I think it was the most I've ever raved about a book in a review, except maybe for Fire the Mind by you. But when I reviewed you, I said what a fabulous book it was, but then I disagreed with you on some points of philosophy.
Well, yeah, that was back in the days of the Sciences magazine. So you'd get like 2,000 words to really do a proper in-depth review, and it was
great. Actually
it was great to read.
4,000 word review.
Yeah, you can't do that in like 800 words that they give you now.
But so the one it wasn't really a critique of the book, but a critique of an idea that is in the book, and it becomes that Glick highlights right at the end, and that's that information is the basis of everything.
Right.
This comes in part from the work of John Wheeler. This is the idea of the it from bit. The it is a physical entity like an electron or a proton, and Wheeler is saying that you can think of it as analogous to a bit, which is the basic unit of information, which is the answer to a yes or no question. It's a really fascinating idea, and there are a lot of people who are pursuing this now. The problem I have is that it makes consciousness primary to reality, more primary. To me, the concept of information doesn't make any sense unless you have a conscious being, and even a being capable of acting on that information as part of the system.
Maybe. Yeah, we've talked about this before, but I think Gregory Bateson, back in that whole, the post-cybernetics days, Gregory Bateson, who was Margaret Mead's husband, right? And he described was it a bit as a bit of information was the difference, the minimum amount of difference that makes a difference, or something like that.
Right.
1 or 0, present or absent, and I can see how you can argue that that's more fundamental. I mean, we think the normal thing would be to say mass and energy, and time and space, or that's the fundamental bedrock, ding and such of the universe, and then information arises when you have conscious beings like us that are parsing the universe into categories and labeling it and theorizing about it and trying to make predictions. But when you really dig down into what matter and energy are, or mass and energy and time and space, these are extremely abstract concepts, and I'm not sure at all that they're any less abstract than the concept of information, which is just, absent or present, basically, black or white. And you can imagine you couldn't have anything like energy or matter or time or space until you had this ability to, again, you said this ability to make a fundamental distinction, and then that's bringing in consciousness. But do you really have to have consciousness to have information? I'm not so sure.
I think you not only need consciousness, but you need free will, because the concept of information, first of all, is defined as a choice, as a choice between a 1 or a 0, or a yes or a no, and it's analogous, and this goes back to Wheeler, to the choice that an experimenter makes when he's probing nature? Is he going to choose an experiment
Yeah.
that we'll find that the photon is acting like a particle,
Right.
or like a wave?
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be. It just can be. It just can be a mindless detector registering the photon in a certain random way, depending how the. I mean, let's just say that. I mean, some kind of like robotic. Like first, don't think about how they got there, but imagine that there's this totally, robotic creature on some planet, has no consciousness at all. It just has detectors that. Register information, photons of light, or it measures gravitational pull, and then its behavior is affected by summing these over, and occasionally maybe throwing in a output of a random number generator, and it would generate something called behavior that was based on information, and yet without any kind of consciousness or any decision or free will. And then go a step further and say, well, where did these creatures come from? Because they must have been made by conscious beings. But suppose that they just evolved, blindly through something equivalent to the Darwinian synthesis of random variation and selection. And I mean, information would be totally key to everything, and yet there wouldn't be any consciousness or free will involved.
For me, the puzzle comes in trying to figure out, some people talk about the quantum classical transition. Where do things go from the randomness of quantum behavior to deterministic classical behavior? And for me, the real puzzle is where you go from a world that's strictly physical and can be understood in physical terms to a world that is psychological and a world of meaning, where that stream of electrons, of pulses representing ones and zeros, has a meaning that is impressed on your brain that cannot be understood strictly in physical terms, that gives you an array of choices. That's why I keep coming back to free will. It's not just that you're observing these messages. Those messages make you behave differently than you would have if you'd gotten different messages or if you had no messages at all.
But that's still not saying that. I mean, that's all true, but you could have none of that, and you could still have information being a fundamental part of the universe every bit as much as mass and energy. I mean, in a way, it's. I mean, maybe it's just an interpretation. I mean, say that. Say that no conscious creatures had ever evolved on Earth, and we, just had, whatever level of evolution you want to stop at, and you have these creatures who have these cells, and the cells are doing all these little processes involving DNA and various kinds of RNA. There's the kinase pathways inside the cells, and all kinds of weird little signaling going on. And inside the cell, none of this stuff is labeled. The cell doesn't know that it has DNA and chromosomes and all of this, and it doesn't know that it has proteins that are getting methylated and genes that are getting turned on or off. No labels. The world comes without labels. All of this would still be working, and I suppose you could describe it all strictly in terms of transfer of mass and energy. But I'm not sure you can, because you have to describe things as being spaced out in a cell and happening at different discrete times. And it almost seems like information does come in there as a very basic component without anyone knowing it's information. It also is unlabeled, just as, without consciousness, there's nothing called mass, energy, space-time, or any of these little molecules in the cell. But and there's also nothing called information, and yet there is information. If you,
I guess I mean, it's bottomless, George. But I guess what the way, if I'm trying to be as reasonable as I can and sort of not to sound woo-woo or mystical, what I'm asking for is, it infuriates me that there's some scientists who are saying that free will doesn't exist. I mean, Stephen Hawking has said this. Sam Harris has said it recently. Francis Crick used to say it.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the way they talk about causation is just absurdly reductionistic and violates what we just know about our own behavior.
Yeah.
And the way that psychological causation works is just so far from a kind of deterministic billiard ball model of physical reality. Those messages that I'm getting right now, hearing you over this phone and looking at this screen here, the only way to understand them is to understand the entire planet, really.
Well, yeah, I understand, but again, meaning isn't information, so... I mean, at the same time we're talking and having this conversation. So I'm not saying that saying information is a fundamental physical unit of the universe is any. I mean, it's physical in the way that time is a physical, essence of the universe. That I mean, you can say that without believing that it explains anything about consciousness or meaning or the subjective experience. The you-ness of being you and all that. And,
see, to me, if you strip it of those components, then it's meaningless. Then there's no value added to talking about
mass,
information.
matter, and energy. I mean...
Yeah, those are pretty complicated, too, but they're complicated in different ways than the concept of information.
Yeah, but I think what you're describing is sort of like what the universe would be like if there wasn't any consciousness whatsoever. It would just be there doing the same thing that it's doing, except there wouldn't be, labels for all of the processes. And
here's another way of looking at it, and believe me, I recognize that.
No, this is, I mean, there's no answer to this.
I mentioned Carl Zimmer and his view of E. coli, and presenting these experiments where seemingly identical E. coli, they're clones of each other, behave differently in like in a bath of the same nutrients.
Yeah.
Some will swim away from a target and others will swim toward it, and these sorts of things. I would grant that maybe you could say that these E. coli are demonstrating something like choice. Maybe that trivializes the concept of choice, but I'm just trying to get at this idea that we need to expand our concept of causation a lot to bring in the realm of, representation, symbolism, where physical things are more than just themselves. They represent something else that might be extremely complex.
Yeah, that's true. Like and there's people trying to do that, right? Like trying to come up with a scientific way of having some kind of representational, like representationalism is some, fundamental part of existence. For example, again, with DNA is a perfect example. You could describe what's going on in the cell without using, the concepts of symbols, and thinking of the genes as standing for, being patterns made out of nucleic acid letters and having this alphabet. So you could explain it all entirely without the symbolic shorthand, but it would be, you'd reduce it to, like every symbol is now standing in for this huge amount of complexity, with a certain amount of randomness underneath. And you could explain it down on that level, just like you could explain what's going on in your computer entirely in terms of electron flow without like popping up to the symbolic level where you even have bits. Of course, now I'm contradicting myself because I'm, assuming that bits are secondary, and it would still do the same thing it was doing without this symbolic level. So when you think of it that way, it's kind of like, we impose the symbolism, and yet there's just something so fundamental, it seems, about explaining what a computer's doing or what DNA is doing. A natural biological computer, it's so natural to explain it symbolically that you wonder if there's some way that this kind of symbolism. I mean, Stuart Kauffman tries to do some of that with his idea of like what is an agent in a physical system? Something that's like,
Yeah.
it's like trying to achieve a goal. It doesn't have to be conscious. It can be like E. coli swimming up an increasing gradient of glucose, for example, and there's a certain like teleological sense that it's swimming toward this, and it makes sense to view it that way and to grant that the E. coli is an agent, and yet it's not, conscious, and it's not making choices in the sense that we seem to make choices.
I actually started thinking about this, or at least I started thinking harder about it as a result of hearing Stu Kaufman give a talk at Esalen back in, I guess it was 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And what I took away from it was when do you start talking about things as agents? Because the idea of it for me was something that an agent, like a rock, is not an agent. An asteroid is not an agent. An agent is something that has goals or has desires, and so in that sense, maybe can you say an E. coli is an agent, or can it be described as a strictly deterministic physical object?
Yeah, Stu would say, E. coli is definitely an agent, but you doubt that.
Well, I'm not. I'm saying,
but again,
I can't really doubt anything.
No, but again, I'm totally with you. Like, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
I mean, there's that famous quote about Spinoza, like, a rock going through the air following a parabolic trajectory. Surely. He must have been speaking tongue-in-cheek. The rock following the parabolic trajectories that hurtles toward Earth, surely has the impression that it's deciding its own path and picking the exact spot where it will land. But if the E. coli swimming up the gradient of glucose is an agent, then why isn't Spinoza's rock?
I think you can think. I think of free will. Most people think of it as a binary quality. I think of it now as something that comes in degrees.
Yeah.
And it's in a way you can think of it as something as simple as degrees of freedom.
Yeah.
You have this entity in this environment. How unpredictable is it? That's another way of looking at it.
Yeah.
How many choices does it have? How many different trajectories can it go on? Humans have more trajectories than any other creature that we know of, even though we are bound in many ways ourselves.
Yeah.
And an E. coli, that's what's so startling about some of this new research. Even an E. coli has more options than we often give it credit for.
Yeah. And yet you have to think whether options is the right word at that level.
Yeah.
Wow. Hey, I just realized we passed an hour and we were going to talk a little bit about radiation.
Yeah. Why don't you summarize because,
I'll just mention the article that I wrote an essay on why we fear radiation so much when, in fact, the real horror so far in Japan has been the 10,000 plus people who were killed by the force of gravity.
Right.
And yet around the world, what we really fear is radiation. So I wrote an essay, just kind of playing with that idea, and I was really pleased to be asked to do this because my favorite place to write for, one of them surely, has always been the Week in Review section in the Sunday New York Times because, I almost had developed a niche at one point where every couple of years when there was some horrible disaster that they would ask me to, to philosophize about it or something and, write an essay. So anyway, I was really glad to do that, and it just got me thinking a lot more about this whole history of our fear of radiation, which I get into, but I also wanted to call attention to this article that appeared during the week, which I'll post a link to, by my colleague Denise Grady, who's a reporter for Science Times, getting into radiation and all this confusing stuff about millirems and milliroentgens and millisieverts. I had never noticed the term sieverts as a measure for radiation until the Japanese disaster, and I think Denise explains that sieverts is, favored in Europe while REMS is favored in the United States. I may have that wrong, but something like that. But anyway, the thing that really interested me about this article was, so little is known about the long-term effects of radiation. And she mentions that there's basically two broad ideas among people who study this, and one is that there's a threshold level where radiation is so low, like say what people are getting in Tokyo and surely what they're getting in California as a result of the Japanese reactor, that it's so low that it doesn't really count.
Right.
And then there's other people, and the first time I remember hearing this was a book that came out when I was in college by Goffman and Tamplin, and it was arguing against nuclear energy, and the argument was that there is no threshold, that the tiniest amount of radiation is capable of sending a gamma ray, zipping through the genome of one of your cells and scrambling the DNA. And it just might be, through the luck of the genetic lottery, hit a tumor repressor gene or an oncogene at a time when you already have 2 or 3 other compromised genes, and then you have cancer. So, and this still hasn't been resolved. And one reason that I've been thinking about it was recently I've been working. I have a room down in the first. My office is in the second story of my house, but recently I've put a second office downstairs, which is, kind of a, one of the good things about, the spin-off of getting divorced is you have more drawer space and rooms. Otherwise, it's horrible. But don't want to get into that. But so I've been working sometimes in this office downstairs, and it's not subterranean, but one wall is built against the earth, and it's built like plank floors over a dirt crawl space, and so you immediately think of the possibility of radon. A long way of saying that. So I did a radon test, and see, it came out. It's one of these things you buy it at Home Depot, and then you put it in the room for a certain length, open it up, put it in the room, and then you mail it off to First Alert, and they send you your little radon report. So the radon level in this room where I've been working was 12 picocuries per liter of air. And it turns out this is like totally off the chart amount of radon.
High.
Yeah, so the average, what they say and what the Environmental Protection Agency advises is that if you have less than 2 picocuries of radon gas measured, not radium, radon gas, that you have nothing to worry about. I think the average in the United States is 1.3. If you have more than 4, you might want to start worrying and take another test and maybe consider doing some kind of radon abatement where you try to vent your crawl space or your basement of radon gas. And if it's 12, that was the highest that the scale that they sent me went to.
And how high is yours?
12. So, do you worry about this or not? Okay, so then you start looking at it, and let's see, I looked it up, and I said 12, and I meant 20. I'm sorry. So then my measured 20 plus, and the scale goes up to 20 picocuries per liter of air. Okay, so so here are the relevant figures. If 1,000 people are exposed to this level during your entire lifetime, in other words, if I never left that room in my house, if I was a shut-in, for example, or a prisoner, 36 out of 1,000 people would get lung cancer who normally wouldn't. Now, 36 out of 1,000 is significant, but, I'm not going to be, in the room 24 hours a day for my entire life. Okay, so that already dilutes it. But here is an interesting figure. If I smoked cigarettes, and the level in my house was at the safe level of 2 picocuries per liter. That's essentially the same number of people out of 1,000 who would get the extra lung cancer. So if I were trapped in the room for my entire life, my chances of getting lung cancer would be the same if I were in a safe room, except I smoked cigarettes. So is that something I should worry about?
I actually...
Sorry for that long diversion within a diversion.
Well, I know we're almost done, but I've looked into this myself. First of all, when I bought a house back in the early '90s in Garrison, I heard about the radon concerns, and we had radon tests for this house that I was going to buy, and I was so curious about it, I did a story for Scientific American on the whole industry that had sprung up to test radon and remediate radon, and I concluded that it was all a gigantic scam.
Oh, I got to read that. That'll help my mental state.
And I also have learned, this is as a result of reading a book by Gwyneth Cravens.
Yes, good book.
Who spends a lot of time in New Mexico.
And, Albuquerque girl.
Yeah, and one of the most powerful set of statistics that she offered in that book, and it addressed this question of whether there is a lower threshold for adverse effects from radiation, was pointing out that you have natural variation in radiation all around the world, ranging from less than 10 millirems a year exposure. This is from uranium and other things that are just in the environment, to over 20,000 millirem a year, which is really high. There's a place in Iran that has that extremely high level. New Mexico also is very high where you are. So if there was a lower threshold, you would expect to find cancer rates correlating with those differences in natural background. There's nothing like that.
Interesting.
Never been found.
Yeah. And that's kind of Denise Grady's story in the Times. It's written straight down the middle. It's just a really, really excellent report, and it really puts this into perspective. And she mentions the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where I was looking that up, and the number of people killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For Hiroshima, this is in the first, during the first few days of the bombing. So these are people who were killed directly by the blast, falling buildings, the heat, all of the effects of bombing, with the added huge dose of radiation, that people got and died of within days. And they estimate between 90 and 166,000, for example, in Hiroshima, and out of a population that had been around 350. So. And the reason the numbers are so fuzzy is because the whole families were wiped out, so they may never their deaths may not have been reported. Apparently, records weren't that good, and the records kept only in the city were destroyed, including the records of how many military personnel were stationed there. But anyway, huge numbers of people, killed right after the initial blast, by the blast in the initial days. But then she goes through in this story and talks about these different studies trying to estimate how many people were killed or got cancer because of long-term effects of the radiation. And it's much more uncertain. And she quotes one scientist that says that it's just much lower than you ever would think.
Right.
And it's really puzzling. And with this radon, too, I went back and looked up some documents of how they decided these risk estimates that I was just quoting from earlier, about what I should worry about with my 20 picocuries per liter of radon gas in the air. And the way they came up with these statistics is they found, well, where do we get people who are getting huge radon gas exposures? Radon miners working underground. Right. So they did all these studies on epidemiological studies on lung cancer in radon miners. And a lot of radon miners are also, the type of guys who smoke.
Right.
It's a pretty awful job, and they probably, after they smoke, they probably go out to the bar and, have a few drinks. But they factored all of this stuff out, and then they came up with a number of lung cancer number for people getting these huge mega radon doses, and then they divide it down to get these tiny amounts. And one scientist that Denise quotes in the story just basically says it's nonsense to do it that way, to take some huge exposure and extrapolate the effect of a tiny dose from that. But then she immediately quotes someone else that says, no, it's not ridiculous, there really is a threshold. So, fascinating issue.
Yeah. Well, it's good to end, I think, on that note of uncertainty.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to save, I don't know, what the hell. Since we're running long, I just want to quickly mention that this month the Los Angeles Book Awards were awarded.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a judge again for the science category, and I just wanted to get the pile here of the 5 finalists and just quickly flash them on the screen.
Okay.
We've been away so long, I think people will tolerate an hour and 20 minutes A few will.
It didn't. It didn't. So Glick's book wasn't included because it came out this year. Right?
It was published this year, and these are all published in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, obviously, the information is going to be a big contender next year, I'm sure. I don't know if I'll be a judge or not. It's always difficult then because you have to disqualify yourself if you know the person. But there's 2 other judges who will love the book probably. That's interesting too. The information is also the title of a novel by Martin Amis.
Huh.
And I was wondering if Jim played with that idea at all in choosing the same title, The Information. Who knows? Anyway, the winners this year, the finalists, were The Emperor of All Maladies, which is this really good book about cancer by Siddhartha Mukherjee, who's an oncologist and a really nice writer, and someone who's now trying to write a big sweeping book about cancer. You have mixed feelings when you see something that good on a subject that you're also writing about, but this is really, really a good book. And this is very relevant to what we were just talking about, Merchants of Doubt.
Yeah, by Naomi Oreskes.
Yeah, your friend Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. How a handful of scientists obscured the truth on issues from tobacco smoke to global warming. I mean, we could do a whole show on that. Yeah. And The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, of course, by Rebecca Skloot, which is, again, we could do a whole show on that. It's just this amazing effort that she made to find the woman whose cells, the HeLa cells that biologists use all the time in their work, including all the biologists at this conference I went to, tracing them down to this woman, Henrietta Lacks, who died of cancer, and being the first person to actually get the family to cooperate and tell her story. And another book that's very relevant to what we're talking about today is called Radioactive. It's called Radioactive, Marie and Pierre Curie, A Tale of Love and Fallout by Lauren Redness. And at first I was really dubious of this because it's an illustrated, beautifully illustrated book, and I thought, well, that probably belongs in the category of graphic novels, except that it's nonfiction. But then I started reading it. In addition to being beautifully illustrated by the author herself, it's also beautifully written by her. So, and finally, The Price of Altruism by Orrin Harmon. George Price and the Search for the Origins of Kindness.
I remember reading about that.
This is the winner. This was the winner, and it was really hard to decide on 5. There were at least 10 other books that seemed on the same level as the 5 we picked, and it just becomes so arbitrary at some point. But we agreed on The Price of Altruism as the best. And
really?
For me,
wow.
For me, it was. I mean, I was again dubious because I've read and we've talked so much about this whole thing about the origin of kindness, and group selection and altruism, and how this would arise in the dog-eat-dog world of evolution. And I thought, I really don't want to read about this anymore, how game theory fits in. But this guy starts at the beginnings, and it turns out just to have this really rich, wonderful history. And this guy's a terrific writer. So anyway, more signs. Again, like last year, I'm just amazed at how many great books, popular books about science are published this year.
It's wonderful and a little depressing when you're in the business yourself.
Depressing. Yeah. Oh, well, just because there's so much competition.
Yeah, Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, if it was all Drek out there, that'd be, you could say, okay, well then I can do that well.
People are still buying this stuff. They're reading this stuff. They're writing this stuff. It's really great when you think what's going on in general in the world of newspapers and magazines. Books are having their problems, but not nearly as much. In science books, there's still a demand, huge demand.
Yeah, well, good. Because also, I bring these people to Stevens to give talks. So
great. Yeah, they should probably all seem to be contenders.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to check all those out.
Well, I'm glad I got to squeeze that in.
Yeah, me too. Wow, so I think this is a record for us.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. I mean, we could just keep going now and do a 2-parter, but nah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
come
we'll
back
start it
soon
to
now that
fade
you're
at
back
some
from your
point. Yeah,
travels.
I'm getting hoarse.
Yeah.
So let's do it again before such a huge long time has passed.
Okay, that sounds great, George. It's really good to
John.
talk to you.
Great
again.
talking to you.
All right, so long.
Okay, bye.